Chapter 1: The Overview of the National Service Training Program or NSTP. What are the learning outcomes for this chapter? One is to describe and outline the history of the National Service Training Program of the Philippines and to identify the provisions of the RA 9163 or NSTP and its implementing rules and regulations for better understanding of the purpose and requirements of the program. Under the NSTP program, both male and female college students of any baccalaureate degree course or technical vocational course in the public or private educational institutions are obliged to undergo one of the three program components for an academic period of 2 semesters. The students, however, are free to choose which particular program component to take. This law was signed by former President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo in response to public interest to reform ROTC. We have three components of NSTP. What are those? Just remember the acronym RALIC. RE stands for Reserve Officers Training Corps. LI stands for Literacy Training Service. C stands for Civic Welfare Training Service. First, let's talk about ROTC or Reserve Officers Training Corps, which aims to provide military education and training for students to mobilize them for national defense preparedness. It has specific objectives. What are those? One is to include preparation of college students for service in the armed forces of the Philippines in the event of an emergency, and two, to become reservists and potential commissioned officers of the AFP. Second component is Literacy Training Service. This program component is designed to train students in teaching literacy and numeracy skills to school children and out of school youth, particularly to underprivileged children in the community and far-flung places. The hope of this program is to continue learning on a peer-to-peer interaction, to teach them how to write, to think, to read, and to become competent in their chosen field. And lastly, the third is the Civic Welfare Training Service. This program component is designed to provide students with the activities contributory to the general welfare and betterment of life of the members of the community, especially those devoted in improving health, education, environment, and entrepreneurship in order to improve social welfare services. A good example of this are to provide seminars and workshops on health education, livelihood skills, advocacy in climate action, and in business sector. Let's now move on in the brief timeline of the legal foundations before the creation of NSTP. Just remember the acronym CPR. C stands for Commonwealth Act Number 1, also known as the National Defense Act. P stands for Presidential Decree 1706, also known as the National Service Law. R stands for Republic Act 7077, or commonly known as the Citizen Armed Forces of the Philippines Reservists Act. The National Defense Act of 1935, or also known as Commonwealth Act Number 1. This was passed by the Philippine National Assembly on December 21, 1935. The purpose of this act was to create an independent Philippine military, a move interrupted by the outbreak of the Second World War, which requires all male citizens between 18 to 30 years of age to undergo training in order to provide a military service in preparation of a possible war as an obligation of every male citizen. Presidential Decree Number 1706, also known as the National Service Law. It was signed by former President Ferdinand Marcos on August 8, 1980. It made national service obligatory for all Filipino citizens and specified three categories of national service in any of the three, either civic welfare service for general welfare of the community, law enforcement service, or military service. This law was used to amend Commonwealth Act Number 1. Republic Act 7077, otherwise known as the Citizen Armed Forces of the Philippines Reservist Act, was enacted by the 8th Congress of the Philippines on the 27th day of June 1991. The Reservist Act provided for organization, training, and utilization of reservists referred to in the Act as citizen soldiers. The primary pool of manpower for the service organizations are graduates of the Reserve Officers Training Corps basic and advanced courses. The state shall maintain a regular force in times of peace which can be rapidly expanded by a citizen armed force in the event of war, invasion, or rebellion. With this law, the CAT in high school level and ROTC in college were formed. Now move on to the summary of the chapter. RA 9163 is also known as the National Service Training Program or NSTP. This law was signed to reform ROTC in response to public interest. It has three components. What are those? Just remember the acronym RELIC, Reserve Officer Training Corps, which focuses on the tertiary students' military training. LEAS stands for Literacy Training Service, which focuses on training students to become teachers for them to impart literacy and numeracy skills to school children and out of the school youth. And lastly, C stands for Civic Welfare Training Service, which focuses on the general welfare of the community for betterment of life in terms of health, education, environmental advocacy, and entrepreneurship. Let's now proceed to the legal foundations of NSTP. Just remember the acronym CPR. C stands for Commonwealth Act Number 1 or National Defense Act, which had an intention to create independent Philippine military that requires all male citizens between 18 to 30 years of age to undergo military training. P stands for Presidential Decree 1706 or National Service Law. It requires all Filipino citizens to render national service in any of the three main programs, namely Civic Welfare Service, Law Enforcement Service, or Military Service. And lastly, R, which stands for Republic Act 7077, also known as the Citizen Armed Forces of the Philippines Reservists Act, that provides training and utilization of reservists to maintain a regular force in the event of war, rebellion, or calamities.